Welcome to the Craftsman Online Podcast, the only 5-star rated Masonic podcast endorsed by the Grand Lodge of New York. Any opinions, thoughts, or viewpoints shared during this program are that of the individual and do not reflect the official position of any Grand Lodge, appendant, or concordant body from which that member may hail. I'm your host, Brother Michael Arce, co-founder of CraftsmanOnline.com. You've joined us for an episode. We're returning to comics and the craft, and we'll be exploring the Moon Knight, as the Moon Knight follows Stephen Grant, who by day and, well, sometimes at night can be a mild-mannered gift shop employee, but becomes plagued with blackouts and memories of another life. We've brought back one of our favorite guests, Worshipful Brother Wes Latchford, for this installment as we dive into the mysteries of ancient Egypt mythology and possible connections to Masonic teachings. Welcome back, Brother Wes.
Thanks, and I'm certainly hoping that the third time back is an indication that we're not just completely nerding people out with discussions like comics. And I guess I have to put a caveat and say at some point we'll get to the DC universe, but there's a lot more to peel back in Marvel.
Yeah, true. I feel like we need to have a little bit more nerd equity. To be fair, but you turned me on to the Moon Knight series, and initially I watched it over Labor Day weekend last year, and since then I've watched it 3 more times, and it even inspired me. I wanted to go as the Moon Knight for the Halloween costume party I attended, but there is no way I was going to spend $130 on a cosplay costume that was all white around people at a bar. So I just went as a knockoff Egyptian pharaoh, which we'll kind of talk about how it kind of could be the same thing. But this series is different from the other Marvel offerings that are available on Disney Plus. What drew you to the Moon Knight series as we start easing our way into the discussion here?
So what actually drew me to Moon Knight was the actual release of the title. Moon Knight #1 hit comic stands as a standalone title in November of 1980, which was literally right at the height of me and my high school buddies' active comic collecting careers. Actually, Moon Knight first appeared in an episode of Werewolf by Night back in '75, so it wasn't like it was a new character. And oh, by the way, if you get the chance to watch Werewolf by Night, that's really weird. Much more so. So yeah, so write down Werewolf by Night. That's the most recent release I've had. So back to the story. So have been engaged with Moon Knight since the early 80s. Actually, a fun story is in order to save money for our burgeoning collections, me and a group of guys that I hung out with, because comics were a whole 50 cents at the time, what we do was someone would claim a title, and then that was theirs, that they were basically responsible for one, buying the collector's version, right? So we'd buy one of whichever ones were our titles, and we neatly put them in plastic wrap and put them in fireproof boxes, and then we bought a second one that was just for consumption, for reading and for fun, and then you just passed them around. So I didn't have to spend, we didn't have to spend $1.50 buying titles that we knew Corey or Kurt or any of the rest of the guys already had, and so we passed them around. So that's where I first saw the Moon Knight, and I was excited when they said they were actually going to turn it into not just a featurette but actually a series. And the other aspect, a little man crush here, but the fact it had Oscar Isaac didn't hurt in the promotion either.
Yeah, I at the point we were talking about this was not really interested in Moon Knight because it seemed like Marvel was getting off of the Netflix where they had done some deals with like Iron Fist and some of the other storylines of less familiar, at least to mainstream comic book fans. And I was like, Moon Knight I never had seen anything about it, but after watching the first episode, I was like, this does a fantastic job of setting up the storyline and really hooking the viewer. And that's where I started making some Masonic connections. Like at first, I think most Brother Masons listening are familiar with the line as the sun rules the day, the moon governs the night. And here we kind of see that dynamic with Stephen Grant, who is our hero working as a lonely kind of nerdy museum gift shop employee with a British accent, but by night, he becomes Mark Spector, who's like this paramilitary assassin guy. Where do you pick up on that Sun, Moon, Stephen, Mark relationship?
Yeah, so there's an interesting couple interesting ties with that. One, it's a time for a little Egyptology 101. Um, but within Egyptian mythology, obviously you had the sun god, which most, a lot of folks are familiar with, Ra, who was the primary northern kingdom sun god and then got adopted by the southern kingdom in the unification of, this, that, or the other thing thousands of years ago. But some things that folks may not be familiar with is there was actually three different entities for the sun god based on the time of day. And so Kepri was actually the sun in the morning, rising in the east, young break of the day, high noon, and the sun at maturity was Ra. And then towards the end of the day, you ended up with Atum, who was the basically the deteriorating, aging god. And then the sun would set, and then the moon would rise. And the god of the moon, who helped evening and night transitors safely from one point to another, was Khonsu. And actually, they call it Khonshu in the series, but the actual Egyptian name is Khonsu. And he was the god of moon and time.
Hmm.
And so you've got the sun and the moon right there. And actually, Khonsu was even known as the embracer, pathfinder, the defender, and healer, because again, he was watching over what was taking place with folks, particularly traveling at night. Again, much like we had midnight lodges, because you didn't, you had to travel at a moon, full moon, in order to have the illumination to get from point A to point B. It might, your lodge might not be at the end of the street. So that was the first sun and the moon thing, and then with that, you get the different personalities, right, between Stephen and Mark. And it's interesting that in the comic series, Stephen Grant is actually a billionaire, not a shop clerk at a museum. But the baseline character had about four different personalities that he would shift from, and the whole concept of what they may have been suffering from, which is not schizophrenia, it's something completely different. But he would leverage those personalities based on what information he was trying to glean. So there's a little bit of detective spy stuff that went along with it. But the TV series, again, sets up this great dichotomy between a very passive shop clerk and again Mark, who is a former vigilante soldier of fortune, who got abandoned in the desert on a mission and managed to crawl into the tomb of Khonsu. At which point Khonsu, basically made him a proposition and said, "I'll, restore you if you serve as, my left hand." He's actually not the right hand; he's the left hand, executor of justice against evil
Interesting.
or evil persons. Mark doesn't really have any superpowers, kind of like Batman, right? He doesn't have any superpowers per se, but he's, exceptionally highly trained, very, very good at using his wits and his experiences to get both out and into trouble. And so if he had any real superpower, it was the fact that he was basically immortal, because if he was injured or died, and you see this a couple times in the series, Khonshu will resurrect him, as it were, and he's back on the front line again. So the other thing that I found interesting in this parallel is that the character of Khonshu in the TV series looks a lot more like Thoth, who in Egyptian mythology had the head of an ibis. So it's the one you traditionally see in the burial of the dead rite with the Egyptians, where he's the scribe of the gods, right? And you see him; he's got the pointy head. Looks like a stork, and so that's what you see in the TV series. But that's not Khonsu; that's Thoth. And Khonsu actually had the head of a falcon and looked a lot like Horus, except that his headgear had a moon on it, not a sun. And but again, you get that sun and that moon connection, and we know full well, as the sun rules the day and the moon governs the night, so should not only the worshipful master, but Masons in general, manage their hearts and their lives, by that normal cycle.
When you were talking about the three stages of the sun, if we could go back to that point, and you talked about the specific names of them. I started thinking, okay, as a Freemason, I would hear the Sun, and I would immediately go, okay, what officer has that role, or is that symbolizes their role? That would be the Worshipful Master. And I was like, okay, so then the Worshipful Master's job is to open and close the lodge. And perhaps we could also connect that where you have the open of the lodge, and then you have the Sun at Meridian, which would be the middle part of the meeting, and then closing it at the end, which I've always found interesting in our ritual when it comes to the role of the senior warden, who rises to help the master open the lodge at the beginning of the day, which makes no sense. And yet it does make sense, because when the lodge is closed, the senior warden is spending that time basically observing and learning what needs to be done when it becomes his day to move to the east and rule. So I was trying to find some of those, deeper connections that may exist there. The other thing is the differences between Mark as the TV character, or Stephen Grant, what we have on TV, versus what we see in the series. What did you prefer? Did you like the almost Bruce Wayne style guy, or do you like the nerdy gift shop employee, as he calls himself?
The thing with the series, both as a comic and then also, again, very, very well done. I mean, just I can't speak enough about it. I think it's underappreciated because it does get a little weird in places too. But having that dichotomy of personalities present in one person. I mean, it's one thing to be billionaire Bruce Wayne and the Batman,
Mm.
or billionaire Stephen Grant, and then former soldier of fortune Mark, um, to something where you have a completely passive and docile individual who does anything and everything. I mean, it's about as socially awkward as you can define, and then literally an alter ego, that is just you know the Jason Bourne of Egyptian mythology,
Right.
and or MacGyver, if you want to go back, and really show your age. But again, so I kind of like that play between the two of them. And as you get further, mini spoiler alert, as you get further into the episodes, you come to start to find out where these personalities originated from. And
Yes.
you really discover exactly where this split multi-personality person in particular, with the two key personalities in the series, evolved from.
Does that exist? Is that storyline the same in the comics?
Yeah, it's similar, but not quite the same.
Because basically Mark creates Steven he manifests him as a way to protect himself from being abused as a child by his mother.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of us can take and empathize with that. Where he built this idea. It's the place where he would go, and he built this idealistic family in his head. That then manifested itself as a personality. And again, however, on the flip side, you've got the other part of that person, again, who's the opposite.
And that's the show within the show where uh Steven is not aware of Mark. And I could totally understand where it's like, if you found out you had, in Steven's case, he has multiple personality syndrome. He's just not aware of these other people that reside in him. So he'll wake up and he won't know what day it is. There's a part in the first episode where he shows up late to a date. He would eat meat he's a vegan, but he's a vegetarian, but would eat meat with a girl that he's trying to impress. Like, he has a goldfish that's continuously dying and then gets restocked.
Yeah, I kind of like where he wakes up in some of the most exotic places in the world, having no idea how he got there, and it's 3 weeks later. It's just,
don't you wish? Must be nice. Where Mark Spector, which you would think is the main character, at least in the series, but they tend to make Steven, at least on the televised version of it, Mark is completely aware of Steven and wants to keep him boxed up or restricted, and is always it seems like deal making with him to get permission to use the body, as he'll refer to it.
yeah, and it's interesting too that there are certain places, and I think we've all had this as well, where Stephen kind of serves as the conscience.
Mm.
That quiet, just you don't know where it's coming from, but there's just something in your head that says this isn't right. And Mark tries to come to terms with that too, because I mean, here's somebody who's done a lot of really nasty stuff,
Right.
particularly as the Moon Knight in the name of good. But again, what's the difference between a superhero and a vigilante? They spend a lot of time in the Marvel comic universe, exploring that theme.
Oh yeah,
And even in the movies, I mean, the whole movie Civil War, it kind of runs along that line of, when do you cross the line of, no longer being a hero and being something you didn't mean to be.
traumatizing that. I refer to it as the timeout episode when Mark and Steven are institutionalized, for lack of a better term, but really are they? And they are confronted with kind of dealing with the harsh truths of reality, which in their world is, hey, you're two different personalities or people that reside in one body. And you're symbiotic, you're connected. And as we think about you're one person in public, you're one person in private, is really having that conversation, as they would say, with the man in the mirror and going, yeah, my actions of how I act this way, I can't come home and treat my family differently, or I can't feel like when I'm in this also, I would just say as another example, I can't act one way when I'm in the safety or the confines of lodge where I'm around other men and we have all taken this obligation of keeping things inviolate in each other's breasts and we can share secret. And I can't look at that as a way to act as somebody different than I would if I was out on the street and just walking around with my non-Masonic friends. Like, I need to be the same person to both people. And that's what I kind of love about that episode where they bring that together. As you touched on, justice is a big part of the plot in this series. And I think for those going, okay, they were talking about Egyptian gods and avatars and left hand and right hand mans. So you have, two kind of protagonists and antagonists depending on how you're looking at it. So you have Khonshu, as you had laid out, the Egyptian god of the moon, who he says that his job is to punish those who have already done harm. He'll say that he's real justice. And then you have the opposite, and I'm going to let you get into the whole Harrow and Amit situation, because it took me a second time of watching it to really understand this yin and yang here.
Back to the Valley of the Kings and some more Egyptian mythology. Yeah, you have Khonshu, who in this series is what he was in mythology, the god of the moon. And if you take him as kind of an additional representation of Thoth, the scribe of the gods. And then you have on the other side, you have a goddess whose name is Ammit. And she's actually the servant of the Egyptian goddess Mot, who, interestingly enough, is Khonshu's mom.
Oh, okay.
She is the goddess of truth and justice. And so the way the whole transition to the afterlife worked in Egyptian mythology was when you passed away, you were escorted to the Hall of Justice. Sounds like a Super Friends thing, but so the Hall of Judgment. Let's use that instead. And there you were judged by pretty much the entire mythological kingdom of whether you were worthy to transit to the afterlife or whether you would cease to exist there. And Ammit was that's actually portrayed as an alligator, was the sub goddess that would exact that justice on a person who's lived a bad life. And the
Mm.
way that was determined was Anubis, who was the keeper of the dead and had the head of a jackal. He would take you into the underworld and was also the keeper of the scales. And what they would do was they would take your heart, again, right, where were you first prepared to be a Mason? They take
Mm-hmm.
your heart and weigh it against the weight of a feather. And it's actually called Mott's feather because she's winged and it actually comes off of one of her wings. And if the scales balance, then you get to continue on to the afterlife. If your heart does not weigh the same as the feather and the scales tip out of your favor, your heart is immediately devoured by Ammit and you cease to exist forever.
Hmm.
You're done. So you get that idea of not just justice, but there's this line of vengeance that goes within the storyline as well, because a lot of people think they're clamoring for justice when in all reality it's actually vengeance that they're seeking, and that can really cloud things. And there's several instances within the series where you see you know they think they're executing justice in the name of something, but what it really is either on their own or on behalf of someone else, because again they're acting as avatars for these Egyptian gods and goddesses on Earth. It's at the behest of somebody else, and there's a lot of manipulation in there too, which is where Harold then comes into play, and because he has his own bizarre relationship with the Egyptian gods too. But that whole justice and judgment thing just kind of gets me to the according to your several imprecations.
My brother came to visit during the holidays. We were looking for something to kind of binge one day, and I'm like, Moon Knight, you're going to love this. This is a really cool series. The production value, amazing. It's got a cool, completely different Marvel storyline. There will be no team ups with this guy because he's got his own people. Just trust me. You just watch it. And he really enjoyed it. But the one thing that I felt they were kind of leaning on, and this is just me asking you as a fan question, we run into the issue in our story that Mark and Steven scales didn't balance, and they're kind of stuck in this purgatory in two places. What was it that we learned that they suffer, or that Stephen and Mark suffer from, and how does that apply in advancing the storyline?
Yeah, so a lot of folks, think that it's some form of schizophrenia, but it's actually called dissociative identity disorder, and that's part of how Mark knew of Stephen. But Stephen, I think, just because of his personality and being so socially awkward, just was not clued in enough to realize that waking up halfway around the world 3 weeks from when you last remember something was probably not good.
And the issue here is that because they were tied together, there's a part of the storyline I'm trying not to give away because I want you to watch this. I think you're really going to like it. If you've gotten this far, you're like, okay, you had me at Egyptian mythology. They do work in this really cool storyline where I know I'm going to get this wrong, and I'm glad to have you here because this opens up the hippo character. But they're traveling on this what looks like the Ark on a sandy river, and they're trying to get to the golden fields, and their scales don't balance. So while they're dealing with that on the Ark and the sandy river, they're also they're institutionalized, or so we believe so, and they're dealing with Dr. Harrow, who's dissecting and like turning the mirrors literally on one to acknowledge that the other exists.
Yeah, and yeah, so the arc you talk about, that's basically exactly what it is it's Horus, who's the god of the underworld, kind of the Egyptian Hades. That's his barge that will take you to the afterlife. And so in actual, mythology, that would have all been determined ahead of time. They'd have done the whole scale thing, and we'd have had that all sorted, beforehand. But it plays out kind of the same because the scale doesn't balance. And so the interesting thing is one of them isn't going to get there, or both of them not going to get there because they're one and the same. And so it actually, kind of it creates a very, very interesting dichotomy and situation where even the Egyptian gods are like, we're not sure how to handle this, because we've not necessarily had somebody who was so intertwined with this really bad and really good side. Do you separate the two? Is the judgment on the body with the two minds, or is the judgment on the minds and the hearts and the soul? And so it's a very, very interesting take on how that might have all played off.
It's almost like a subconscious experience or out of body experience, because it's the first time that we actually get to see both of them on screen together, at least in the television series. Normally they're bargaining with each other of who's going to have control of the body at that point. And this is kind of the first time that it looks like there's two people, like twin brothers on the screen.
Yeah, and I loved how they pulled that off without it looking really, really chintzy. Um, but the other thing, interesting thing that plays out with that, and I think twin brothers might be a good analogy for it because as that particular episode and that scene plays out, you actually start to see Mark, the mercenary, build some empathy. Which has never really existed. And on the same
Mm.
side, you start to see Stephen, step up, and realize, you know, if I'm not, if I don't stand for something, I'll fall for anything. And so he actually, takes a stand and actually, I think at one point, actually, um, puts himself between Mark in some danger and basically puts himself into harm's way, which is something he would never have done, up until that point. So with that, then I think you start to see a reconciling of the two personalities where they still exist, but they're not necessarily antagonistic of each other. They actually realize that they draw strength from each other, or they can draw strength from each other, and I think that's what what we can find in Masonry too,
Mm.
because a lot of times when we think about justice and judgment, we can talk about the transition from it EA to Fellowcraft when you approach the porch and you're told about the two pillars, where the wisdom and knowledge of masonry was stored, and but within those two, I mean, those are also representative of a couple of things that work with it too, both power and control. So we're given this power of knowledge, but we're also asked to maintain control of it, and I think you see that with the two different personality characters. Is they were both on opposite ends of the control spectrum, and it wasn't until they finally came to meet in the middle that they kind of on either side, whether it was incredible passiveness or super hyper aggressiveness, they were able to circumscribe those desires and keep them within due bounds. And it was at that point when then they were actually both very effective together. It wasn't either one having to take the show. They both were working together. So kind of cool thing. I hadn't thought of that.
And it took watching it a third time to go, okay, so in masonry, we're familiar with the two pillars. We got Boaz and Jachin, strength and beauty, right? And as a candidate, when you're coming in through the degrees, there's something significant happens at that pillar and they're explained to you. And at that moment, because I'm going to use this word, you, in my opinion, become the point within the circle. We actually have the physical representation of a point and of course the two parallel lines that would represent that. My thought was that scales, that if we were trying to pull in the connection, is less of the scales of justice as in dealing out justice to others, but the scales of equality, in my opinion, of, okay, you need a little bit of strength and you need a little bit of beauty. And of course, strength and beauty in the allegorical terms, not as in the actual, you need to be strong and pretty, like our guest, Brother Wes. I'm going to borrow a thought that a good brother of ours, Brother Angel Millar, had suggested, and that in his latest book, he talks about the concept of being kind of a well-rounded man, and that you have to be a warrior, but you also need to have that artistic side to you as well. And it seems to me that when you put those two people together in Stephen and Mark, you have Moon Knight or whatever this entity is, and that's what allowed them to eventually break through the river sand and get to back in the real world and finish up the series that we loved.
I think that's a key element that we sometimes tend to forget, is that masonry is about the whole man. It's we pat ourselves or throw just loosely use the term, we take good men and make them better. And my question is always how.
Mm.
How do we do that? And part of it, is this admonition, within all of our degrees, even in the appendant bodies, is to take and make yourself more well-rounded, better educated, most modo, more learnt, I'm trying to use all the words that my mom would say. Your mom ain't never learned you nothing. Um, but and because by then doing that, you build those things that allows you then to become a better man, right? And you have a greater toolkit that honestly expands well beyond all the tools of masonry indiscriminately, to something that is even more applicable in your daily life, both as as a husband, a father, a brother, a son, whatever particular, a boss, an employee, Pee Wee football coach. You can name the hundreds and thousands of instances where the lessons of masonry serve not only example for you, but should be an example for other people who look and go, that's a really good guy.
I would tell you that there are many other Masonic themes that are also a part of this. Geometry, some of the ancient mystery school ideas are presented, but the cool thing is that ancient Egyptian mythology that I think a lot of us uh, understand exists in some of where we are in Freemasonry, at least some of the old origin stories. And to see it literally be brought before you in life on television is pretty cool. They do a great job with the special effects, and we don't want to ruin it because the closing credit scene does open up the idea if there is going to be a season 2, which would be phenomenal. My last question, just as a comic book fan, is how much of what we see in the Disney series, with I think it's like 6 or 7 episodes, how much of that is from the comic book? Was that a storyline, or did they bring a couple other pieces of it together?
It was kind of an amalgamation of stories. If I recall, I think Moon Knight as a separate title ran for about 7 years before it finished out. So there's plenty for them to go back and dig through. But even in the whole universe, there are base storylines, but they really have, a good portion of these stories are all fairly original. You could probably, if you had, your own comic store, you could probably go back through and go, oh yeah, well that was written by Jack Lindsay, and the coloring was done by so and so, and that storyline was in fourth edition, volume 45. But yeah, so fortunately the brain doesn't quite work that well anymore.
Fortunately, you're not that big of a comic book nerd.
They're out there and they sojourn to San Diego every year for Comic Con.
I want to thank you again, our most excellent guest. I love bringing this guy on, and I'm going to ask you off camera what we're going to be going to next. But this has been the Craftsman Online Podcast, and our guest this week, worshipful brother Wes Latchford. Thanks so much for coming on. You can say thanks for having me.
No.
Right. If you've enjoyed this episode and you want to hear more, you can just tell Siri or Alexa to play the Craftsman Online Podcast. We're available on all streaming platforms with new episodes every Monday morning. Until next time, on behalf of my guest, Wes, yes, thank you for coming on.
It was a pleasure being here.
Perfect. Until next time, let peace and harmony prevail.